Every supercar brand you know and love is on the verge of bankruptcy. But why? Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm your host, Primo, and today we're going to talk about a question that I think is kind of crazy, but I've been getting it from time to time now, and it's very relevant. It shows me that people are really getting the pulse of this supercar thing and really starting to understand things, and it's bringing up questions. So the big question is, why do supercars constantly lose money? And if they do, how do they stay in business? How can a brand lose $400,000 a car and still be operational? And it's true. Every supercar brand you know and love has been and still is on the verge of closing up shop for good, mostly due to money troubles. So let's discuss why this happens and how some of them fixed it. At least for now. The first thing we need to talk about is numbers. Sales, by definition, is a numbers game. Last year, Ford sold 2 million vehicles, which is pretty impressive, right? Ferrari, argued as one of the best in sales, has only sold 220,000 in its lifetime. Yeah, I know that's hard to believe, but for context, in 1950, they sold only 26 cars. In 1990, they sold 4,309. They just broke the 10,000 per year mark in 2019. And you're probably thinking they're a lot more expensive, so they must make more money, right? Well, not really. Ferrari does make effectively more at about 80,100 per car, but it's still a numbers game. With a record of 10,000 vehicles per year, that's only $801 million for the entire year. In comparison, Ford made $158 billion in the same time period, and suddenly you realize that $801 million is a drop in the hat in comparison. Sure, they're making more money on the car, but it doesn't translate to effectively more money to cover the expenses a supercar has that Ford really will never have, such as even finding a buyer. It's even worse for other brands. Porsche only makes $19,750 per car, Maserati $5,800, Jaguar $929, Bentley loses $19,750 on every car they sell. And now everybody is asking, how do they stay in business? And I know your first statement, Primo, why can't they just make cars like Ford does? First, it's a problem of production, if they could even make that many vehicles. But the reason they can ask for a premium for each car is a finely tuned balancing act. Although this guy you may have heard about, Henry Ford, started the assembly line, supercar brands stuck to the craftsmanship of being handmade. They also use premium parts like select leathers for interiors, high horsepower performance engines, while major brands like Ford were cranking out more and more cars, using the same engine in every build, using more and more plastic. Supercar brands needed to continually up the game by being more selective and exclusive. Luxury brands would go out of business in an afternoon if they followed the same trend Ford did with, say, the Mustang, even if they could. And the car's value would drop like a stone while sitting in the showroom, and even more so moments after leaving the parking lot, shattering that collector facade. If you have any questions about when this has happened in the past, look no further than the early Testarossas and the current Urus. Those are good examples of where high production has resulted in some valuation issues. We could go into the problems that hand-built meant high performance, low reliability, but if they aren't being used a lot, it isn't really that big a deal. Owning a hand-built supercar is like owning a classic piece of art that is exclusivity. It means something to the buyer. So the more they build, the more that brand starts to look watered down. I also need to add that after the 1970s, government regulations started to play a big part of this equation. Supercar brands' only defense to increase government environmental demands is getting a pass because they don't make a lot of vehicles, but the EPA's goalposts keep moving. The NHTSA and the EPA require a certain fuel economy among vehicles that a manufacturer makes. Brands can build a Viper or a Corvette because they're such a small part of what the company produces. But a brand like Lamborghini and Ferrari, they don't have that buffer zone. today they have to purchase environmental credits from brands like Tesla and still build these cars. But even now, they face the ever-present potential of being regulated out of existence. And it's a very real consideration. You also might think that most supercar brands make their money in the repair market, but that's actually a crutch for a supercar. High performance cars do take a ton of upkeep, but if you only drove the car 100 miles before putting it in a collection, that maintenance doesn't mean much. I've seen cars with under 100 miles and collector cars that see little or no use. So now the manufacturer has to invest in a bunch of parts bins just sitting around that won't be used for 30 to 40 years when someone finally restores one. Not to mention the idea of an exclusive supercar dealership wasn't even really a thing until after the 2000s. Most repair shops were dedicated independent shops that just pocketed all the money. And if you look around, you're going to still see those places in business today. You may think that research and development plays a massive role in designing a vehicle, and even more so when you want to make big power, and in effect it does. The truth is every car company spends a good amount on research and development, but it's usually in something like a Camry or an F-150 with a dedicated buyer and millions invested. When building, say, a Veyron, there's no point to go by, no buffer zone to stave off the cost, no dedicated buyer waiting in the wings, and the cost will be immense. Every time you make something new, you'll need to recoup that cost at point of sale. It's why the Veyron used to lose $10 million per vehicle. Then next you heard it was only $8 million per vehicle. Then it went down to $6 million per vehicle. And now with all the spin-offs and renditions, the company is now considered profitable. Are you starting to see how this works? So how did things start to change? Well, the first big hurdle started when big brands that understood the supercar market started to buy up these companies. It's no secret that Volkswagen, along with Porsche, absorbed a lot of good brands, Bentley, Lamborghini, etc. This meant an influx of capital, but it also meant that there were parts that could be used on other vehicles that could empower the new purchased brand. Lamborghini, for instance, saw the incorporation of the entry-level Gallardo, and then it shared that platform with the Audi R8, which also spread around that development cost. Bentley used the failed Phaeton to build the new awesome Continental, and they worked with BMW to empower Rolls to make sure both brands succeeded, and that was a partnership that went very successful even after they parted ways. The next thing they did was crush importation. See, back when I was a kid, if you wanted a Lamborghini, you just imported and legalized it. If you've ever seen those notorious bumpers on the Countach, people just loved them and other people wanted to install them. Those were just U.S. spec cars that had to meet the NHTSA requirements to be legalized. The problem was these gray market guys, they didn't hand the money back to the company once the transaction was complete. They sold the vehicle and took all the gains themselves. So around the early 2000s, manufacturers started opening exclusive franchise dealerships and made working with gray marketers a punishable offense. This means that they kept most of the money in-house. It also meant that dealers had to have guaranteed inventories, so now they were actually selling vehicles even when they didn't need to. These new dealerships would also be responsible for repair and maintenance, lending an air of credibility, and now offer training for techs to do the work. Stores would now need to keep parts inventories, effectively spreading around the debt even more, and for many, it worked. Still, brands like Porsche were suffering, so Porsche did something revolutionary. They broke the mold, and they gave the customers what they wanted and introduced the SUV. It's no secret that the biggest selling Porsche is the Macan at 22,667 examples, with the number 2 being the Cayenne with 19,001. Today, SUVs are all the rage. Lamborghini got the Urus, Aston Martin the DBX, and that grew their sales by 224%. SUVs could also do something these brands couldn't do in the past, which is what we talked about earlier: mass producing a vehicle and not having to keep the numbers limited. You were expected to crank out big numbers, and because the parent brand had an SUV, they just take the existing design, expound upon it, put a new badge on it, share parts. That would keep your R&D budget in the hat for bigger projects. And now you know why each brand has seen record sales over the last few years. So fast forward to today in social media, and these brands are more popular than they've ever been, which opens up all sorts of opportunities to incorporate lifestyle concept. Lamborghini and Ferrari have fashion brands. They license their logos out to everything from designer watches to video games. And I'd say Ferrari makes more selling shirts than it ever did selling cars. Now they have things like the Lamborghini Lounge, where members can sit around, appreciate their vehicles with fellow owners, speaking the language of their brand, and building communities around this experience. Something that Porsche has been doing for pretty much forever. It's important to say each brand has its own hurdles, and this isn't consistent for everyone. McLaren, for instance, doesn't offer an SUV, but they offer a wider range. Their best marketing is their pure performance, but they're still strapped for cash. They certainly can't afford to make an EV, and I think it played a key role in their bankruptcy woes. In fact, I know the reason that many of these brands broke the mold and started offering SUVs is because they needed an influx of cash for the EV buffer in case their bread and butter actually got banned. So nobody is out of the woods yet. In fact, while I was writing this script, it was rumored that McLaren was already considering an SUV for the future. The Veyron is probably one of the greatest outliers because it was simply a Porsche passion project. They didn't really have an idea of where they wanted to land for gains. They just wanted to build the fastest car in the world, a Concorde moment, if you will. The idea that they had a goal and they were willing to pour money into it. But notice that they didn't R&D future cars so much as just expounded on the first one. They continued to move the mold around until they made back the money, and it worked. But that's only because Porsche was willing to spend the money to keep it tied up in the brand for years and years. Their new plan is to weather the storm of electrics by being owned now by Rimac, which plans to add a hybrid option for future cars. So now you're seeing another trend. We have lost cars though. Keeping the Viper around was a constant fight for the bottom line. Maybach represented $1 billion loss to Mercedes, losing $400,000 in every vehicle they sold. And let's be honest, everybody has a breaking point. Somebody has to give, and they finally folded the brand and made it a trim level where it finally found success. But had Maybach been a standalone brand, I doubt we'd still see it around today. That still doesn't cover all the problems with running an exclusive brand either. Management and how they do business. You may have noticed that coach builders aren't really used anymore, and bespoke customization programs are on the rise, and I expect that to continue across the board. A lot of this stuff is really about just trimming the fat on how we used to build supercars, and we're going to continue to see as this belt strikens, they're going to take more and more actions to make sure that their bottom line equates to profit. The biggest problem supercars have that nobody is going to discuss is pretty simple. A lot of the people that love them can't afford them, and the people that can afford them don't always see the reason to buy one. Let's be honest, you don't need a supercar, so buying one is taking up upkeep costs and other concerns on a vehicle you may not even drive. It's easier to collect than perform. They are a labor of love, and many will just pass up such a car for a nice, easy, cheap luxury vehicle. And I think that's why BMW, Mercedes, Audi, and Lexus, most importantly, flourish so well. Sure, they depreciate like a stone on a lake, but people know what they're getting into and they can afford it. It's considered safer, but it's only because they're ignorant of the changes and growth these supercar brands are currently experiencing. Not everybody is a savvy investor, and if I had a dime for every time I heard an accountant say play it safe and buy a Lexus, I'd have enough to build my own Veyron. Me personally, the experience these cars have will never compare to a Bentley, a Rolls, a Porsche, or a Ferrari, or even a Lamborghini. In fact, it's why people who have owned supercars stick with them, because they're worth it. They have an identity all their own. It's not the car you need, but is it the car you deserve? It's really eye-opening when you drive a car on the weekends and sell it for minimal loss in comparison. But not every supercar can say they can do that. So the trick there is doing a lot of research on the car you're going to buy and understanding what you're going to get into. But I like the idea of actually keeping a supercar as an option because it does open your horizons and lets you see there's a lot of guys out there that are actually making money after buying a car. Still, every supercar brand, it's just one bad decision from disappearing entirely. And in some cases, their salvation, the investors, are just as much a bane to their existence as the people that design them. The only thing that really carries them is that nobody wants a day when Lamborghini, Ferrari, Porsche, Rolls, or Bentley don't exist. Those names mean something, and as long as they do, expect someone to always try and come to the rescue. So is your favorite brand going to go out of business tomorrow? Probably not. But the reality is even with the growth that they've had, supercars make up an interesting glitch in the matrix. They're one of those things that collectors are into, but collectors can be fickle. There's a lot of things that change and a lot of things that they're doing now to save themselves that actually may hurt them in the long run. It's one of those things that we just have to pay attention to and see. And when you're on that knife edge of how much you're going to spend versus how much you're going to make, it's always a guessing game, and it's always a game of chance. What is easy for you, though, is to keep us out of bankruptcy. And how you do that is simple. Like, follow, subscribe, make sure you share this video out to the people that you think would really appreciate it. Keep watching these videos and sharing them to your friends, and we'll keep telling you the secrets that supercars are hiding right under your nose. And if you really want to help us out, we have a product section. You can check out some of those things. Pick up some of your favorite shirts, maybe a sticker, and maybe at some point we might own a supercar ourselves. Or, even better, maybe we'll build one. But we won't have that answer until the next video. See you then.